Good morning. Earlier on, just a few minutes ago, we watched a short clip from a TV series called The Chosen. And so if you've never come across The Chosen before, it's a TV series. They're 3/7 of the way through the whole thing. It's available on YouTube. You can stream it to your smart TV. There's an app that you can watch it. But it looks at the life of Jesus, and we just saw a short extract from their interpretation of the verses that we just read from John chapter 5. Series 4 will be starting soon. There's not an exact release date for when it will start streaming, but if you can't wait, then Series 4, Episode 1 and Episode 2 will be shown at 7:30 on Tuesday at the View Cinema at the Grafton. So go onto the View Cinema's website if you want details. I've got no idea how many tickets they have left, but that's otherwise you'll just have to wait a few more weeks for it to start streaming through those various routes that I've already told you. Now, what is clear from the short clip that we've watched, what we've read, and it becomes even more clear if you watch kind of a whole episode or a number of episodes, is that to make a program like this about the life of Jesus based on the Gospels, there are a lot of gaps and there are a lot of backstories that you are going to need to fill in, or else it's going to be quite a short film. And to fill in the gaps and to create some backstories, people have had to use their imagination. And I think as long as we remember that some of this is just simply what people have made up in their heads, then I think this can be a really valuable tool in helping us to engage on a different level with the gospel stories. So if you've not watched any of it, I would recommend you do. I've watched all of that's available so far, and I think it is really, really powerful. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's got my personal recommendation. So just to give you an idea, if you were to watch the whole of the episode from the clip that we just saw, some of the backstory that they creatively and imaginatively fill in for us, we learn that this guy is called Jesse, and he happens to be the brother of Simon the Zealot, who was to become a disciple of Jesus. The reason Simon hasn't visited his brother, and this is part of I've been having a really bad day part, Simon hasn't visited his brother all the length he's been at the pool, is because as far as he is concerned, he is a zealot. He's got some very extreme and fanatical views. This whole pool is just superstitious mumbo-jumbo. It's got nothing to do with God. Surely God's not going to be involved in sending an angel to stir up the water so that the first person in can be healed and the rest aren't. And so that's why Simon has never visited. In fact, the fact that Jesse is here is a real embarrassment to the whole of his family. Now, obviously, all of that is creative imagination. It has got no basis in history. It has got no basis in the Bible story. And whilst it is highly unlikely that those events happened in that particular way, it is not impossible. I think when you watch the series and you think which bits are made up and which bits are actually in the Bible, you see that there is a consistency. It's maybe unlikely, but not impossible. They are consistent with kind of the big picture that we see across the Gospels that we have written for us. So it is quite possible, for example, that those that were religious fanatics would consider this pool to be, or they'd have some serious questions about this pool and what Jesus is even doing here. God, in his wisdom, has given us the Bible, a story which is full of stories. It's full of narratives. The Old Testament, the New Testament, large parts of it are stories. And if you're anything like me, when you read stories, you're creating pictures in your head. you're creating your own film of what you're reading, whether it's the Bible or whether it's a fiction book that you're reading. You're creating in your head what you're reading on the page. And if you've ever read a book and then watched a film of the book, then quite often your enjoyment of the film can sometimes be seriously impacted and affected by how the actual film plays out with the images that you've created in your head from the book. Do the characters that have been created by the film, how do they compare with the characters that I've created in my head? And when it comes to the Bible, we are supposed to read, we're supposed to reflect, we're supposed to meditate on these passages. And I think as we do that, part of that process is going to involve imaginatively and creatively filling in some of the gaps, or at least asking questions the Bible doesn't answer because it simply doesn't go there. It just leaves big gaps. And I think that part of the way that we do this and part of the way that we fill in these gaps is part of the way that a text that is 2,000 or 3,000 years old becomes relevant and impacts our lives today. This term, we are looking at a series of encounters with Jesus. And the last two we've looked at have been encounters where somebody came looking for Jesus. Nicodemus came looking for Jesus. The parents with the young children came looking for Jesus. But in today's story, it's very different. This man wasn't looking for Jesus. Jesus went and found him. He didn't even know who Jesus was. And I'm sure that if we had time, and I was to get you into small groups, I'm not going to, so just relax. If we were to get into small groups, and I'll say, read this passage through, and then read it through again, and then read it through, maybe read it 3, 4, 5 times, and then write down a list of 10 questions that you have about this story. Then I'm sure that there would be a lot of repeated questions, but I'm sure that across all of us, there would be maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe even 40 different questions that we have about this particular story. Just a few verses, but lots of questions. I'm sure that if you were to go away and read it a few more times, there would be some questions about verse 4. If you've got an old NIV, you will notice that it goes verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 5. The verse 4 isn't even there. And in the new NIV, the one that we've got at the back, you'll see there is a number 4, but it immediately goes to the footnote, and then it goes on to number 5. It's all this bit about sending an angel and stirring up the water. What's all that about? So there might be a whole range of questions around that. There may be questions about, well, why did Jesus choose this man? What about all the other people sat around the pool? Why weren't they healed? Imagine being one of them. And Jesus just kind of walks in and heals one person and walks out. If Jesus can heal with just a few words, then why didn't he heal all of them? The man doesn't answer Jesus' question, do you want to be well? Instead, he gives a reason as to why he's not been healed, and yet Jesus heals him. So did he have any faith? Did he believe that Jesus could do this? Did he even realize who it was who was asking him this particular question? When we read that Jesus learned that this man had been at the pool for so long, we could assume, or we might assume, that Jesus learned this by asking somebody, that man down there, how long has he been here for? But it's also possible that Jesus just knew. Just in the same way that in the last chapter he knew that the woman on the well, she had had multiple husbands. Before that, he knew all about Nathanael. And so maybe Jesus simply knew through supernatural knowledge that this man had been here for so long. And then other questions we might have. Well, why did Jesus tell the man to pick up his mat? If he hadn't done that, none of the problem with the religious leaders would have happened, or was Jesus deliberately trying to provoke a confrontation with the religious leaders? And we might have a whole range of questions about them and how that they can be so focused on the fact that this guy is carrying his mat that they totally ignore and forget and overlook the fact that he's just been healed. After 38 years, he can suddenly walk just by speaking. And so there might be a whole heap of questions we have around them. And then when Jesus meets this man again at the temple, and he says, "Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you," we might have questions around that. Was this man's lameness as a consequence of sin in his life, or is Jesus talking about something else? And then why does he go back and say to the religious leaders it was Jesus, getting him into more trouble? Maybe he thought that he was doing Jesus a favor. Maybe this was he was giving more evidence that Jesus is the Messiah, and surely these people will see Jesus for who he is. So lots and lots of questions that we might have. But what are the questions that John wants us to ask? You know, John's account of Jesus' life gives fewer miracles than Matthew or Mark or Luke. John doesn't call them miracles, he calls them signs. They are things that are pointing to who Jesus is. John is clearly trying to do something. He is a man with an agenda. He wants us to read or to hear these stories about Jesus and to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And that through that belief, we come to have new life in his name. One of the things that we're doing here at CBC for the whole of this year is intentionally running the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, alongside everything else that we do. And some of you are engaging with the Sermon on the Mount in a variety of ways throughout the course of the year. There are times when, there may be quite often times, when we read the Bible and the Bible uses certain words that just kind of, we just read and we think we know what they mean, but if someone was to sit us down and say, right, can you tell me what this word means, we might actually struggle to tell them. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the merciful. And that's one of those words that we might think we know what it means, but we might not be too sure. And I think that the Gospels do a lot. And part of what the Gospels do is that they show us what some of these words actually look like. And I think that this story shows us what Jesus means when he says, "Blessed are the merciful." And he looks at this word, merciful. Merciful means you show compassion. You show pity on someone. And that's what we see Jesus doing here. And Jesus expects us to go and do likewise. Just as an aside, there is, and you might have picked this up in the footnotes, there is some uncertainty as to what the actual name of this pool is. But if it is Bethesda, then that means the house of mercy. And so it ties in with the story, which is possibly why some of the the scribes, chose that particular name. But this man certainly experiences mercy on this Sabbath as he met Jesus. Jesus didn't have to come to this pool. I'm sure it's the sort of place that that people would avoid if they could. I mean, hygiene levels were probably poor. The people there, I mean, it was full of really sick people. No doubt there was a smell. You probably had to be really careful where you put your feet, and you probably wanted to be really careful that nobody touched you or that you didn't accidentally bump into someone. Regardless of the video that we watched, I don't think that the religious leaders would have been there. I don't think it's the sort of place, they wouldn't have seen Jesus do this, they'd have learned about this as they saw this guy somewhere else. It was that kind of place. This man didn't even know who Jesus was. He hadn't called out to Jesus, like in some of the other encounters that we will and have looked at. He didn't get his friends to go and get Jesus. He didn't get his friends to carry him to Jesus. Instead, he's simply relying on his own ability to get into a pool of water. Jesus didn't even have to meet this guy, but he does. This verse behind me from Exodus 34 is the most frequently re-quoted verse in the Bible. I thought we'd learnt it last year, but I had a quick skim through the list this morning and I couldn't find it, so we'll have to correct that over the next few weeks with the verse of the week at some point in the next month or so. A few hundred years before Jesus, there were a whole load of Hebrew scholars who realized that the world was going Greek. And they set about translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And the Greek word that they used here to translate the word that the NIV has translated behind me as compassionate is the same word that Jesus uses in the Sermon on the Mount for merciful. So some English translations actually have this verse as the Lord, the merciful and gracious God. And so God is merciful. And so it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus is merciful and that he wants us to be merciful as we seek to become more like him. And many of us will know that to be true in our own lives, that God is merciful because Jesus was prepared to die on a cross in order that we might know forgiveness and peace with God. And he was prepared to die on a cross for us whilst we were a long, long way away, headed and facing the opposite direction and going further away. And yet Jesus was prepared to come and to die for us. And many of us will have stories of how Jesus came looking for us. And hopefully in our home groups this week, you will have an opportunity, some of you, to share those stories. And for those of you who are brave enough and would like to do that, there may be opportunities in coming Sundays to share those stories in a wider context of how Jesus came looking for us whilst we were a long way off and still heading in the wrong direction. There's a lot wrong with social media, but there's a lot good with social media. And on social media this week, I was reminded 2 days ago of the story of David Wilkinson, who God sent to help and to engage with some of the most violent gang members in New York City. And he set up a charity which today is still helping. I think they help somewhere around about 24,000 young people every day be released from addictions to drugs across the United States and across about 80 other countries as well. You can read about that story in The Cross and the Switchblade and Run, Baby, Run. Many of you, and we prayed for them earlier on, many of you will know that as a church we've recently started supporting this charity, Tech Aura, in Albania. A charity which does a range of things, but amongst the things that they do is to work with the most marginalized within an already marginalised community. And so those sorts of people that nobody else wants anything to do with, and to share the love of Jesus with them, to reach out to those who maybe think they're beyond the love of Jesus. You know, you can't get much lower than the man in today's story. But the good news of the gospel is that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how far you've gone, you're not beyond the reach of Jesus, that he will come looking for you. And Jesus says to us, as he said to this man, I don't want you to explain why you are where you are or how you got here. The question I'm asking you is, do you want me to rescue you? Let's pray.